Hey everyone, it's Jim from Mellow Amps, and in this episode we're going to take a look at various solder types. Now, there is a lot of solder out there that was never designed for electrical work, so be careful. A lot of solder is used for brazing. That's when you're basically soldering two pieces of metal together. So let's say you're making a nice little vessel in sheet copper, and you need to join two pieces of metal. That is brazing, or you could even say you're soldering the joint together. That kind of solder is totally inappropriate for electrical work. There's also, of course, plumbing solder. That has a flux in there that's going to damage your electronic components and your circuit board, so you definitely don't want plumbing solder. What you want is electrical solder, or electrical rosin cord solder to be more precise. And it's going to come in all different kinds of sizes, diameters, even the flux core will vary. So I'm going to make up a little cheat sheet, and I'm going to show you a little bit about what those various types of solder are, so that you can identify them. So here's a fairly big spool of vintage Rosin multi-core solder. And it's it's 5 pounds, and most of you can't use 5 pounds effectively on the bench. So if you got a really good deal on some reasonably fresh solder, and it's the right stuff and it's 5 pounds, I'll show you how to deal with that. Typically though, you're going to want probably to buy a 1 pound spool of solder. That will last a good long time, and a holder like this, let me get it up here on the bench for you, will help spool it quite easily. Let's get it up here for you. And that's how my bench is set up. I just put it on the back of the bench beside my soldering iron, and then I just unspool it. Now, sometimes if you have a big spool, or you have some very fine work and you don't want to be tugging away at the big spool, you can just make up a little loop. So I'll show you how to do that. So just cut off a good length, and then that's it. Just make a quick little loop like that. There you go, Bob's your uncle. Now you can solder like this. So you can just feed like this, so you don't have to worry about unspooling or having a big pile of unspooled solder on your bench, which can be a bit of a pain. So that works really well. Let's get that out of here. Pardon my reach. Now, the diameter really makes a big difference. So the rule is, if you're working with a very small component, something you're probably going to need to be using magnification to see what you're doing, and a very fine soldering tip, of course, something like this is what you would be using. Now, this is vintage multi-core solder, and look how small that is. And this is a little oxidized, so I'm going to recommend that you work with fresher solder than this. Now, this type of solder, Rosin multi-core, is Charles's favorite. So this is all he uses on his bench, and he has successfully used oxidized solder that, it's not badly corroded, but you can see it's got a little oxide layer on it. It seems to be fine with the built-in flux that's inside multi-core, but yeah, I would recommend, if you're just starting out, make sure you have fresh solder. This is what fresh solder looks like. It's nice and bright. So very small components, very small diameter of solder, and really big components are going to have a much larger diameter solder, and this is more multi-core solder. Here's some more, and this is actually multi-core that's sort of, it's a little bit on the heavier side. More multi-core, very heavy. What about if you're a little afraid or a little concerned about working with lead? Well, you should be, But if you take precautions, it's really not going to be that much of a hazard. So ventilation is absolutely important. So you should have your window open even in the wintertime, at least a little bit. And you should have some kind of small amount of forced air. So I use this to send air across the bench. And it's absolutely critical that if you work with a tin lead solder, a standard solder, that you wash your hands before every meal. Even if you're just stopping for a coffee break and a donut, wash your hands before you start prepping in the kitchen. And you could even wear a pair of good quality gloves. This is what we use on our lab benches and in the shop. These are nitrile gloves. Really not a big fan of latex gloves. A lot of people are allergic to latex or they'll develop an allergy. Nitrile are strong. They're resistant to chemicals, and they're more expensive, but you get what you pay for, and your health is certainly worth it. So so gloves are a good option. What about working with a lead-free solder? So there's a couple of different kinds. There's a tin-based solder like this, in which it is 99.3% tin and 0.7% copper, or you can be even working with 100% silver solder. These solders, even though they're lead-free, they are problematic, particularly for beginners. They really require, you got to have good chops and a really great understanding as to what is required to make a good solder connection. So I'm really not going to recommend that anybody who's a beginner start out with any of the non-tin lead solders. You're going to struggle, and I honestly don't think it's a requirement that you use these solders. So this is what I use on my bench and have done for years. This is Kester. This is a good American company. Let's read the label together so you can sort of figure out what it says. So it says it's a net 1 pound. It's rosin, so that's rosin cord. That's the flux. The flux helps clean off any impurities that are present on the component that you're soldering. So whether it's a resistor or a capacitor leg, or whether it's the actual PCB board. Hang on a second, I've got some boards right here. Let me go grab one. This is my master pack of boards, so we can keep track of what's actually in the store. But these pads here, even though they'll get prepped just before you use them, they can have a little oxide layer on them or little impurities. The solder itself can have little impurities, and when you have a flux, it essentially etches and cleans the surfaces to be soldered, so that when the pad that you're soldering to, the components, whatever you're soldering to, when they come together with that solder joint, there's nothing in there that's going to corrode or impede the bond that you've created. So that the flux is really important. And of course, if you watch this series, you know that I'm a big advocate of adding a really tiny little drop of auxiliary flux in addition to the flux that's inside the solder. A little dab here. I've got my rosin flux here. A little dab of no clean flux really helps improve the whole process. Okay, and what about the percentages of tin and lead? Well, they're always prominently displayed on the label. Let's just zoom in a little bit so you can really see that. So SN, that stands for tin, so that's 63% tin. PB is for lead, so that's 37%. And this is a sort of a modern formula that's been in use for quite a few years now. The standard electrical solder mix or blend was was 60/40. And the pros, I think, discovered that a little higher tin content made for a little better connection, a little better facilitated the wetting out of the solder. And I would agree. I really prefer the 63-37 blend. And the size is always marked on here as well. So it's 0.031 of an inch or 0.8 millimeters. That size is a very good general size. It melts very quickly. It's big enough that it's got a decent amount of flux inside of the core. And it can handle most standard preamplifier builds without having to float such a big long run of solder to fill the joint. So you really won't be you'll fill maybe this much and boom, Bob's your uncle. That's all you're going to need. So choose your diameter for the application, but I would say 99% of all the work I do on my bench and Charles does on his bench, we use a gauge similar to this. It could be slightly larger or slightly smaller in diameter, but this is by far the most common. Well, let's take a quick look at what the heck the rosin core and multi-core solders look like. I'll be right back. Okay, so this is just a rough sketch of what's going on. So if you were to look at a cross-section of your solder core, you would see that in standard rosin cored solder, the rosin or flux is in the core of the solder, and around it is the tin lead blend or mixture that the label tells us. So in this case, with the standard Kester, it's 63-37. But what about multi-core solder? Well, multi-core solder, let's say quad core, and it comes in all different configurations. So I think there's a quad, there's even 5 cores. I think 3 is fairly common. Anyways, there were quite a few different configurations. What they do is they put inside the core of the solder, they put a bunch of little tubes of the rosin. Now, what that means is that you've got a lot more flux built into the actual solder, and it's distributed quite evenly so that when you melt a multi-core solder, you end up with a really good wash of flux. And what Charles has found is that unlike my bench, where I use a little tiny dab of auxiliary flux, like this Caig No Clean, he doesn't have to use any additional flux. There's enough flux already in the solder that it cleans the surface really nicely. So he prefers to work with this stuff. I find it actually tricky to use, and I prefer working with the Kester. So, and the Kester, of course, is even though it's not cheap solder, it's a lot cheaper than multi-core. Multi-core is a more expensive process to manufacture. So, so that's something really to consider. And because there are a lot of variables with learning how to solder, you may have to try a couple of different types of solder before you really decide what your favorite type is, what works best for you on your bench. But if you take your time, you'll find something that you really like that'll work well for you. Once I discovered the Kester, I stayed with it, and I've never wanted anything else. I always keep spare rolls of it in backup because we do a lot of prototype building, a lot of amp building, so we go through a lot of solder. And if you're just a hobbyist, if you buy a 1-pound spool, you'll have it for years, maybe even decades. Just store it somewhere safe so that it won't be exposed to big environmental changes, and it'll keep for a long, long time. This vintage multi-core, this could be a 50-year-old spool easily, and it's still just fine. Yeah, so show caution with the solder that you're using. Make sure you've got electrical solder, rosin cord. Make sure you choose the right diameter for the work that you're doing. Something like 0.8 millimeters is what you want, somewhere close to that, or 0.031 of an inch. And don't go with the cheapest brand you can find. Most likely that will be inferior solder. So offshore brands, non-branded solder, I would avoid them like the plague. This is one of those things where shopping cheap is never going to help. It's never going to pay off. It's always going to make for bad work. So always go with a really good top brand name and pay the money for the right stuff. You'll never regret it. Okay, this is Jim signing off.